Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating and mysterious tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare to dive into a world of secrets, hidden societies, and an ancient power buried beneath the silence of a forgotten church. Don't forget to subscribe, as this story will leave you questioning everything. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Silent Bells of St. Dunstan's. The fog that clung to London streets that evening was heavier than usual, pressing against the buildings as though trying to swallow the world whole. Sherlock Holmes, with his long coat billowing behind him, walked with measured steps towards St. Dunstan's, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. The eerie silence of the city only amplified the sensation of dread that lingered in the air. As the gas lamps flickered weakly in the damp mist, Holmes pushed his way past the heavy iron gates of the churchyard. The scent of wet stone mixed with the faint scent of incense, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. St. Dunstan's stood as a quiet sentinel in the heart of the town, its weathered walls and crooked spires casting long shadows on the cobblestones. The bells, once the proud voice of the parish, had not rung for nearly 2 weeks, and their absence had stirred something unsettling in the people. The church, though surrounded by the bustle of life, now seemed to retreat into itself, as if the very soul of it had been silenced along with the bells. Holmes paused before the entrance, inhaling the cool evening air deeply. His keen senses, ever alert, noted every detail. The cracked windows of the church, the worn steps that had seen too many years of use, the distant murmur of townsfolk discussing the inexplicable stillness. To most, it was an oddity. To Holmes, it was a puzzle that required solving. He moved forward, his mind already at work. "Watson," he said, his voice smooth and composed, "do you ever wonder what remains when even the most familiar sounds vanish from our lives? What is left when silence becomes as deafening as the bells themselves?" His eyes were distant, focused not on the church but on the world beyond it, where the heart of the mystery lay. Perhaps this silence is an invitation to something darker. Dr. John Watson, who had accompanied Holmes on countless investigations, looked around uneasily. He was not accustomed to seeing Holmes in such a reflective mood. "I do not like this place, Holmes. It feels wrong. A place where death lingers." Holmes turned his sharp gaze to Watson, eyes gleaming beneath the brim of his hat. "And yet, Watson, it is the wrongness of a thing that often leads to the truth. Do you not hear it? The quiet. It is unnatural." He looked up at the tall spires of the church, his mind already piecing together the fragments of what had been left behind. "Let us see what secrets St. Dunstan's has been hiding." They walked up the steps, their footsteps the only sound in the empty courtyard. The doors of the church creaked ominously as Holmes pushed them open, and the smell of mildew and aged wood greeted them. The interior was dim, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced like spectres on the stone walls. The faintest echo of a bell rang out in the distance, a single mournful tone that seemed to mock the church's long-standing silence. Holmes stepped inside, the grandeur of the place not lost on him, but he could feel the weight of its abandonment. "The bells, Watson," he murmured. "Have you noticed the absence? The way the air itself seems to hold its breath." He reached for his magnifying glass and scanned the floor, crouching by a patch of disturbed dust near the altar. His eyes narrowed, and he gestured for Watson to join him. Watson's gaze followed, a sense of unease settling over him. "What is it, Holmes?" "Look at the dust," Holmes said softly. "It is not merely disturbed. Someone has walked here recently. And not just anyone. There are tracks, faint but clear. A hurried exit, a warning of some sort." He stood, adjusting his coat with practiced grace. "The silence here is not a coincidence, Watson. There is something at play within these walls, something that requires our attention." As they ventured deeper into the church, the faint sounds of the outside world seemed to grow more distant, swallowed by the vast, hollow space around them. Holmes's eyes flickered over every detail, the subtle way the walls seemed to shrink inward, the disrepair of the pews, and the way the air was thick with the weight of time. Every corner of the church whispered secrets, but none of them spoke louder than the silence itself. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice low, as though speaking louder might break the fragile stillness. Holmes straightened, his expression distant. "I make of it a puzzle, one that has been waiting to be solved, and I intend to see it through, Watson. Whatever silence lingers here, it will speak once more." He turned, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering light of a lone candle. "The question, Watson, is not why the bells have stopped. The question is, what is it that they have been hiding?" Watson said nothing, knowing better than to challenge Holmes at this stage. He followed the detective, each step echoing in the empty church as they approached the bell tower. Holmes was already lost in thought, his mind racing ahead, each piece of the mystery slipping into place like a puzzle. There was no doubt in his mind that something dark had occurred within these walls, something far more sinister than a mere mechanical failure of the bells. The silence pressed closer, as if waiting for them to uncover its secrets. Holmes could feel it, the weight of the unanswered questions pressing against him like the fog outside. He turned back to Watson, his eyes glinting with an intensity that betrayed his quiet confidence. "Come, Watson. Let us find out what truly lies beneath." With that, they ascended the narrow, creaking stairs that led to the bell tower. The faint, ghostly sound of the bells rang again, so faint that it almost seemed like a distant memory. Holmes's pace quickened, his anticipation growing. This case would not be a simple one. Of that much he was certain. As they reached the top of the tower, the thick scent of rust and old wood hit them, mingling with the cool, damp air. The bells loomed above them, their once proud faces now covered in dust and cobwebs. Holmes's gaze darted across the space, his mind working tirelessly. There was something here, something hidden among the shadows and the forgotten corners. He took a step forward, his heart racing in quiet anticipation. The mystery was just beginning. The sound of their footsteps reverberated in the quiet church, the only break in the oppressive silence that had so firmly gripped the place. Holmes paused by the bell mechanism, his gaze fixated on the rusting metal as if it could reveal its secrets. Watson, ever vigilant, took a cautious look around, noting the steady drip of water from the cracked ceiling and the cold, stale air that seemed to suffocate the room. A strange unease lingered between them, a quiet acknowledgement that something far darker than simple neglect had taken root in St. Dunstan's. Holmes turned to Watson, his voice low but filled with the usual calculated certainty. "It would appear, Watson, that this place holds more than just a missing bell. Someone has been here recently, though not in a way we might expect. The question now is, who?" Before Watson could respond, the door to the bell tower creaked open behind them. The figure that stepped into the room was tall and gaunt, a priest in his late 40s with a face marked by weariness and a quiet sorrow. His black robes were old, faded in places, but there was an unmistakable dignity to his presence that suggested years of service. "I see you have discovered the cause of the silence, gentlemen," Father Edward said, his voice steady but laden with an underlying tension. His eyes, though soft, seemed to carry the weight of some unspoken burden. Holmes studied him closely, his sharp eyes noting every minute detail. The way the priest's hands trembled ever so slightly as he gripped the doorframe, the deep lines etched into his forehead. "Father Edward, I presume?" Holmes inquired, his tone neutral, though his piercing gaze never wavered. The priest nodded slowly, his gaze lowering briefly to the floor before returning to meet Holmes's eyes. "Indeed, you are correct, Mr. Holmes. I had hoped you would come, though I had hoped for a different reason." Watson could feel the palpable tension in the air. He stepped forward, offering a warm smile in an attempt to break the chill that hung between them. "I trust you have heard of the trouble surrounding the bells?" he asked, trying to gauge the priest's reaction. Father Edward's eyes darkened slightly, his expression clouded with a mix of guilt and resignation. "I have," he admitted, his voice tinged with a hint of sorrow. The bells were once the soul of this church, a symbol of our faith. And now, silence. It is a grave thing. Holmes took a step closer to the priest, his analytical mind already working. And yet, Father, the silence began with the death of your bell ringer, Thomas Wren. A death that remains, shall we say, unexplained. Can you tell me about that? The priest flinched at the mention of Thomas's name. His jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed as though he might refuse to answer. But then, with a deep sigh, he spoke, his voice quieter now, tinged with regret. Thomas was a good man, Mr. Holmes. He had his flaws, yes, but he was faithful, dedicated. I can't imagine why anyone would wish him harm. Holmes studied the priest closely, sensing the hesitation beneath his words. Of course, Holmes replied, his voice calm but with an edge that suggested he was not quite ready to let go of his suspicions. But the circumstances of his death do not quite match the words you speak. You see, Father, the silence, the absence of the bells, is not an isolated incident. It's a piece of something much larger, and I suspect you know more than you're letting on. Father Edward stiffened at this, his face hardening. I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I know nothing of what you speak, he said sharply, the warmth drained from his voice. I am but a humble servant of this church. Holmes, however, did not seem swayed. His gaze remained unbroken, probing, as if searching for some hidden truth behind the priest's eyes. Perhaps you do not realize it yet, Father, but your every word, every gesture, tells a story, Holmes remarked quietly, and I intend to unravel it. Before the priest could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the stone corridor outside the bell tower, drawing their attention. A woman entered the room, young, perhaps in her late 20s, with long dark hair tied loosely behind her. Her face, though serene, carried a sorrowful quality, as though her grief had become a permanent feature of her expression. She was dressed in dark mourning attire, and her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying for days. Watson could not help but notice the raw sadness that seemed to emanate from her. Her gaze flitted briefly between Holmes, Watson, and the priest, before settling on the latter. Father Edward, she said softly, her voice a quiet whisper that barely carried through the stillness of the bell tower. Father Edward straightened slightly, his demeanour changing in an instant. He gave her a small, sad smile. Margaret, he said, his tone softening. I was just explaining to Mr. Holmes the strange circumstances surrounding the bells. The woman, Margaret it seemed, nodded slowly, her eyes flickering with a mixture of confusion and grief. She stepped further into the room, though she did not approach the men. Instead, she looked up at the massive bell looming above them, her gaze distant. I still don't understand why they stopped, she murmured. My husband, Thomas, he would never have allowed it. He loved the bells. He loved this church. Her voice trembled slightly at the mention of her late husband, and Holmes watched her closely, noting the subtle signs of distress. The brief quiver of her lip, the way her hand fidgeted with the fabric of her dress. There was more to her story than grief alone. He could sense it. Mrs. Wren, Holmes said, his tone gentle but direct. Tell me, what do you remember about the last few days before Thomas's death? Were there any unusual occurrences? Anything at all? Margaret's eyes darted toward the priest before returning to Holmes. She hesitated, clearly struggling with the weight of the question. She began, her voice faltering. I don't know. There was a disagreement. Thomas had been distant, but we didn't speak much of it. He had become troubled, I think. Holmes leaned in slightly, his curiosity piqued. Troubled? In what way? Margaret bit her lip, and for a moment it seemed as though she might not answer. But then, with a quiet sigh, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. There were letters. Thomas started receiving strange letters, ones that he never spoke about. I think they were from someone at the church. He didn't want me to see them. Holmes nodded slowly, processing her words. I see, he said. That is indeed curious. And did you ever read these letters, Mrs. Wren? Margaret shook her head, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Number. He kept them hidden. And now it's too late. Holmes exchanged a look with Watson, who stood silently observing the exchange. There was a clear thread of suspicion running through the conversation now, and Holmes knew that this case was far from simple. As the tension in the room thickened, the priest spoke again, his voice trembling slightly. I must insist, Mr. Holmes, that we tread carefully. There are matters here that should not be uncovered. Holmes turned to him, his expression cold and unwavering. That, Father, is precisely why I am here. The bell tower felt colder now, the air thick with an unsettling stillness, as Holmes, Watson, and the others stood in the heart of the church. Margaret's confession hung between them like a fog, and the tension within the room seemed to tighten with every passing second. Holmes had a way of listening, not just with his ears, but with his mind, drawing the silences and hesitations into the puzzle he was slowly assembling. Margaret's words about her late husband's mysterious letters lingered in his thoughts, tugging at the edges of his reasoning. Without speaking further, Holmes motioned for Watson to follow him as he walked to the far side of the room, near the bell mechanism. His mind was already racing, pushing aside the lingering words of the widow to focus on the facts. It was not enough to hear what people said. He had to see it for himself. He had to understand it. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, each detail under his scrutiny. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots as Holmes approached a small dusty alcove near the corner. Here, the shadows seemed deeper, the air thick with neglect. The dampness of the space clung to him, and he could hear the faint drip of water from somewhere above, a constant reminder of the church's age. He knelt down, carefully brushing aside the cobwebs that clung to the wall. Holmes, what do you see? Watson asked, his voice low, the weight of the moment pressing in on him as he approached cautiously. Holmes did not respond at first, his fingers brushing against something hard under the dust. His eyes, intent on the small space before him, narrowed as he cleared more of the debris. At last, he pulled out a small rusted object, a key encrusted with dirt, its shape almost obscured by the years of neglect. He held it up to the light, his expression unreadable. Interesting, Holmes murmured, turning the key over in his fingers. This should not be here. It does not belong to any common lock in this church. Watson, who had been watching with growing curiosity, leaned in. What do you think it means? Holmes stood slowly, his eyes still fixed on the object. A key like this, Watson, tells me that there is something hidden. Something that has been kept from sight. A place where secrets are kept. He pocketed the key and straightened his coat. This is no ordinary church, and these are no ordinary circumstances. The two men turned back toward Margaret and Father Edward, who had remained at the opposite end of the room, exchanging quiet words in hushed tones. Holmes, his mind still piecing the puzzle together, began walking toward them once more. Before they could exchange further words, the sound of footsteps echoed from below, heavy and deliberate. Holmes paused, his senses sharp as the door to the bell tower creaked open once more. This time, it was a figure they had not yet encountered. A man in his mid-30s, dressed in the humble attire of a labourer. His face was pale, his eyes wide and filled with a mix of fear and confusion. Please, Mr. Holmes, the man said urgently, his voice shaking. You must come at once. There's been an incident. Holmes raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face. What kind of incident? He asked, his voice still calm, betraying none of his thoughts. It's Thomas Wren, the man stammered, his hands trembling as he spoke. He's gone. Not dead, but missing. I found him, Mr. Holmes, or what's left of him. The words hit like a blow, and for a moment, Holmes stood perfectly still, The key in his pocket suddenly felt heavier. He exchanged a quick glance with Watson, who looked equally unsettled. "Show us," Holmes said, his voice firm yet tinged with the urgency of the situation. The labourer nodded, his face drawn and pale, and he turned on his heel, leading them swiftly through the darkened halls of the church. The walls seemed to close in as they descended into the dimly lit undercroft, the cold air growing heavier with each step they took. The smell of damp stone and aged wood clung to their clothes, thick with the oppressive silence that had once been so comforting to the townspeople. They arrived at a small hidden room, nothing more than a narrow space beneath the altar, where the flickering light of a single candle cast eerie shadows across the floor. It was here that the labourer had found Thomas Wren, or what remained of him. Holmes stepped into the room first, his keen eyes taking in every detail. The space was cramped, the air thick with the scent of decay. And there, at the centre of the room, lay the body. It was not the full body one might expect, but rather a twisted, grotesque form. The legs and arms were bent at odd angles, as though contorted in ways the human body should not allow. The face, half covered in shadows, was pale and lifeless, but it was not the pallor of death that held Holmes's attention. "No signs of a struggle," Holmes muttered under his breath, bending low to inspect the body. The only thing that seemed unusual, beyond the twisted posture of the corpse, was the blood, thick and dark, staining the floor around Thomas's body. "The cause of death remains unclear," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He felt Watson's steady presence behind him, a subtle reminder that his deductions, though logical, still required the context of human understanding. "Was this where you found him?" Holmes asked, his tone low but controlled as he turned to the labourer. The man nodded, his face pale. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. He was not like this when he first went missing. He was just gone. And then, when I found him, it was like this." His voice cracked slightly as he stepped back, clearly disturbed by the scene. "I don't know what happened, but it's unnatural." Holmes stood in silence for a moment, taking in the body before him. The twisted limbs, the bloodstains. Nothing about this felt like a simple death. This was something far more deliberate. And yet, there was no obvious explanation, no weapon, no clear cause of death, no sign of how it could have happened. "I believe," Holmes said finally, his voice calm and measured, "that this is only the beginning of our investigation, Watson. This is no ordinary murder." As he said the words, he was already piecing together the clues in his mind. The key, the blood, the odd positioning of the body. It was clear now that someone had staged this scene. But who? And why? "Stay close, Watson," Holmes continued, turning his gaze back to the body. "We need to know more. This mystery, I fear, is far from solved." The scene before them was ghastly, too ghastly perhaps to fully comprehend at that moment. Holmes stood above Thomas Wren's contorted body, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in every detail with the practiced precision of a seasoned investigator. Watson stood beside him, his face pale, mouth slightly agape in disbelief. The two men had been on countless investigations, but the grotesque sight before them was enough to unsettle even the most hardened of detectives. Holmes didn't flinch. His mind, as always, was working rapidly, dissecting each element of the scene before him, his thoughts cold and methodical. He crouched down next to the body, carefully inspecting the position of the limbs. There was an unnatural, almost ritualistic quality to the way Thomas had been arranged, though there were no clear signs of foul play that might point to a specific method of murder. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, It's difficult to make sense of. No clear injuries, no obvious signs of struggle." His voice betrayed a trace of unease. Holmes gave a brief glance up at his companion. "I know," he replied, his voice calm and controlled. "That is the most peculiar aspect of it. Whoever did this didn't need to overpower him physically. No, This was something else. He stood up and moved to the far side of the small chamber, his eyes scanning the room, looking for anything that might give him a clue. And I believe it is connected to the silence of the bells, Watson. Not a random act, but something more deliberate. The room around them felt thick with tension. The smell of stagnant air mixed with the faint scent of decay, the dampness of the underground chamber creeping into their clothing as they moved. Holmes felt the cold bite of it on his skin, but it didn't matter. The clues were what mattered now. They were the only way out of this tangled web of mystery, and he would follow them until he reached the end. He motioned for Watson to help him examine the body more closely. They rolled Thomas's stiff limbs to reveal the patches of blood that stained the floor beneath him, and Holmes noted how the stains seemed to trail off in an unusual pattern. The blood? It doesn't flow in a typical way. It seems almost purposeful, Holmes muttered. He reached for a piece of cloth from his coat pocket and pressed it gently against the bloodstains, testing for any signs of what might have caused it. The blood was thick, dark, and had the slightly coagulated look of something that had been left for a while. It was unnervingly out of place in a murder scene. There was something unsettlingly controlled about the way it had pooled, as if it had been deliberately arranged. "This is no accident, Watson," Holmes continued, his voice steady but laced with an intensity that was unmistakable. "Whoever did this is not merely hiding behind some inexplicable murder. No, they are making a statement." Watson knelt down beside him, carefully studying the blood pattern. "Could it be part of a ritual?" he asked cautiously. The thought seemed to fit with the ominous atmosphere, but Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to the walls around them, his eyes scanning for anything that could suggest a deeper meaning. The room was sparsely furnished, just a few old chairs and a weathered wooden table covered in dust. "There's something else," Holmes murmured, his hand brushing against the stone walls. He stopped at one corner of the room, a small but noticeable crack running along the surface. "Look here, Watson." Watson followed him and observed the crack. It seemed insignificant at first, but Holmes's attention to detail was legendary. He crouched down to inspect it more closely, his fingers running along the stone surface, pushing against the gap where the mortar had weakened over time. Suddenly, the wall shifted ever so slightly, and Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "Ah," Holmes said, standing up and brushing off his hands. "This was not just a murder scene, Watson. It's a message." He turned to face the labourer who had found the body, his expression sharp and focused. "You did not mention this crack in the wall," Holmes said, his voice cool but commanding. The labourer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Holmes and Watson. I didn't notice it before," he stammered. "It's been there for as long as I can remember, but I never thought to look closely." Holmes's gaze narrowed as he approached the crack, gently pressing on it once more. "I believe there's more hidden here, Watson. Something this man could not have known about." He turned to the labourer. "Was Thomas ever involved in any repair work in this room? Did he have any reason to be here?" The labourer hesitated, his brow furrowing in thought. "Well, he did help with some of the repairs a few months ago. Nothing major, though. Just fixing up a few loose bricks, I think." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed. And I suspect that he may have uncovered something he shouldn't have. Something far darker than a simple repair. We are dealing with more than just the murder of a bell ringer, Watson." He pressed against the wall once more, and this time it gave way with a soft grinding sound. The hidden compartment behind the wall was revealed, and in it, a small box lay nestled in the shadows. Holmes's pulse quickened with the thrill of discovery, and he reached inside, pulling out the box with careful hands. The box was old, its wood worn smooth by time. Holmes turned it over, his fingers brushing across the surface, and noticed strange, unfamiliar symbols etched into its surface. There was no doubt in his mind now. This was no ordinary church, and Thomas's death was no ordinary crime. "Watson," Holmes said softly, It seems we have only begun to uncover the true nature of this case." The box felt heavy in his hands, and as he opened it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper seemed to rise from the shadows around them. The room grew colder, and the hairs on the back of Holmes's neck prickled with the sensation that they were no longer alone. Inside the box was an old, tattered letter, its ink faded but still legible. Holmes read it quickly, his brow furrowing as the words sank in. The letter spoke of a secret society, one that had been operating within the walls of this very church for generations. It seemed to suggest that the bells were the key to something far more sinister, something that involved Thomas Wren's death. "This," Holmes began, his voice trailing off as he looked at Watson. "This is just the beginning. We are not only dealing with murder, we are dealing with something far more dangerous." The room was quiet now, save for the occasional creak of the old church as the wind whistled through its cracks. Holmes held the letter carefully, his eyes scanning the faded words once more. The ink was nearly illegible in places, but the meaning was clear enough. The secret society mentioned in the letter, the bells, Thomas's death, it was all connected in a way that Holmes was only beginning to understand. He folded the letter with deliberate care and slipped it into his coat pocket, his mind already turning over the implications of its contents. "Well, Watson," he said, his voice as sharp and controlled as ever, "it seems we have stumbled upon something far darker than a mere murder. These bells, these cryptic messages, they point to a network of secrecy that runs deeper than the church itself. We must learn more, and I suspect our next course of action should involve speaking with those closest to Thomas Wren." Watson, who had been quietly observing his friend, nodded, though his brow remained furrowed in concern. "You think Father Edward knows more than he's letting on?" Holmes gave a tight, knowing smile. "I do, and Margaret Wren as well. She spoke of Thomas's troubled state before his death, but there's more to her story, Watson. And I suspect the priest is not as innocent as he would like us to believe." Their footsteps echoed as they made their way back to the main hall, the sound of each step carrying through the emptiness of the church. The tension between them had thickened, a quiet unease that mirrored the growing sense of urgency in Holmes's mind. They had to move quickly. The longer they waited, the more elusive the truth would become. They found Father Edward in the sacristy, kneeling in quiet prayer before the altar. The sight was almost incongruous, considering what Holmes now suspected about the priest's involvement in this dark web of deceit. The flickering candlelight cast long, trembling shadows across the room, adding to the sense of mystery that seemed to surround the place. Holmes cleared his throat softly, but the priest did not stir. "Father Edward," Holmes said, his voice measured and cool, "I hope you don't mind us interrupting. There are matters that we must discuss." The priest rose slowly, turning to face them. His expression, though still kind, was tinged with a note of defensiveness. "I expected you would return," he said quietly. "What else do you wish to know?" Holmes studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp. "I believe there is more to this story than you've told us, Father. You mentioned before that Thomas was troubled. Troubled by something, I suspect. What did he say to you before his death?" Father Edward's gaze faltered, and for a fleeting moment his composure slipped. He took a breath, steadying himself before meeting Holmes's piercing eyes. "Thomas was a good man. He had his demons, yes. But I don't know how to explain the way he started to change. He became withdrawn. He stopped coming to confession. And then, those letters." Watson's brow furrowed. "Letters?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile thread of trust they were still attempting to weave with the priest. Father Edward nodded slowly, his hand trembling ever so slightly as he clasped his hands in front of him. "Yes. Letters that were not meant for me, but that I saw. He never told me much about them, but the few times he let me read one, They were strange, full of symbols, words that made no sense. I thought it was just the ramblings of a troubled mind. Holmes's gaze never wavered. Father, you say you thought they were the ramblings of a troubled mind, but I believe they were part of something much larger, something that you are not telling us. I need you to be honest, Father. What did you see in those letters? Father Edward hesitated, his fingers tightening in his clasp. His lips pressed together as if he were trying to summon the courage to speak. The room seemed to close in around them as the silence stretched on, and finally the priest spoke, his voice barely audible. I did not want to involve myself. I thought it was better to leave it be, but now I see how wrong I was. Those letters, they spoke of a group, a society. They referred to the bells, how they were the key to something ancient. I thought it was madness, Mr. Holmes, but now I fear it was true. Holmes's face betrayed no emotion, but internally, a spark of realization lit within him. A society, he echoed, almost to himself. A secret group that has been using Thomas for some purpose, and the bells are at the center of it all. Father Edward nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. Yes, but I never fully understood it. I still don't. I tried to steer Thomas away from it, but he grew more and more distant. I fear he was involved in something far beyond what I could comprehend. Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, his mind already spinning with the new information. And what of Margaret? Do you think she knew? Father Edward's expression darkened, and his lips tightened into a thin line. I don't know. I cannot say. But she was very close to Thomas, and I fear she might have known more than she's letting on. The room was silent for a moment as Holmes considered the priest's words. This revelation had changed the course of their investigation. The murder of Thomas Wren was no longer an isolated event. It was part of something much deeper, something dangerous. Thank you, Father, Holmes said at last, his voice cool but tinged with a sense of urgency. Your honesty, however reluctant, is appreciated. I will need to speak with Mrs. Wren next. Perhaps she can shed more light on what her husband was involved in. Father Edward nodded, his face pale. Be careful, Mr. Holmes. There are things in this town that should remain buried, things best left untouched. Holmes gave a brief nod, his gaze steady. I intend to uncover every last one of them, Father, and I won't stop until I do. As they left the sacristy, Watson could feel the weight of the priest's warning pressing against them. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but each new revelation only raised more questions. Who was this society? And what was their connection to the bells? The urgency to find the answers had never been greater. Holmes, however, seemed unfazed. It is clear now, Watson, he said, his voice low. We are not simply dealing with a murder. We are unraveling a conspiracy, one that has been hiding in plain sight for far too long. The afternoon sun barely penetrated the fog that seemed to have settled over London like a second skin. Holmes and Watson made their way down the narrow, winding streets to the modest home of Margaret Wren, her late husband's widow. The cobblestones beneath their feet were slick with dampness, the faint smell of the river lingering in the air. The air felt colder here, more oppressive, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. As they approached the modest townhouse, Holmes could feel the shift in the atmosphere. There was a quiet tension that clung to the house, a sense of anticipation that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was a small, unassuming home, but to Holmes, it felt as though it was holding secrets far greater than its size suggested. The mystery surrounding Thomas Wren's death had grown more complicated with every conversation, and Holmes knew that the widow would hold key pieces of the puzzle. Whether or not she would reveal them was another matter entirely. Margaret Wren, Holmes said softly, his voice barely above a whisper as they reached the door. She may be more than just a grieving widow. There is something she is not telling us, Watson, and I intend to find out what it is. Watson nodded, But he too was feeling the weight of the case settling around them. Every turn in the investigation had led to more confusion, more suspicion. Margaret had been one of the last people to see Thomas alive, and Holmes had already begun to suspect that she knew more than she was letting on. But why had she been so evasive? Was she protecting someone, or was she simply trying to shield herself from the horrors her husband had become entangled in? Holmes knocked sharply on the door, the sound reverberating in the stillness. The door creaked open slowly, revealing Margaret standing in the threshold. Her face, though composed, showed signs of wear. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, and the lines around her mouth spoke of grief far deeper than the loss of her husband. Still, there was something about her that made Holmes pause. Her demeanour was guarded, her gaze wary. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Margaret greeted them with a forced smile, stepping aside to allow them entry. Her voice was soft, the words carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for such a simple greeting. "Thank you for allowing us to come by, Mrs. Wren," Holmes said, his voice smooth, though there was a sharpness in his eyes. "We've come to speak with you about your late husband, Thomas. We understand that you've had quite a difficult time since his death, but we believe that you may have some information that could help us with our investigation." Margaret hesitated for a moment, her hand tightening around the doorframe. Then, with a soft sigh, she stepped back and allowed them to enter. The inside of the house was modest but tidy, though a certain emptiness lingered in the air. The furniture was arranged neatly, as if the home had been preserved in some futile attempt to hold on to what had been lost. A few framed photographs of Thomas and Margaret stood on the mantelpiece, though their smiles seemed distant, almost like ghosts frozen in time. "I'll offer you some tea," Margaret said quietly, her voice trembling slightly as she turned to the small kitchen. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she was trying to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. Holmes remained standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression that was both detached and focused. Watson took a seat by the window, his gaze drifting outside, though his mind was clearly elsewhere, absorbed in the gravity of the case. The quiet hum of the house, the ticking of a distant clock, seemed to magnify the silence that hung heavily between them. Holmes broke it after a moment, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Mrs. Wren, I must ask you, what did Thomas tell you about the letters he was receiving? You mentioned before that he had become troubled, but you never explained what was troubling him. Was it the letters that caused him such distress?" Margaret froze, her back still turned as she reached for the teapot. For a split second, Holmes caught the faintest tremor in her hands, and his mind raced. There was something in her reaction that betrayed a deeper fear, something she was trying to hide, even from herself. But the moment passed quickly, and she turned to face him with a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. "The letters," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He never told me much about them, but I know they bothered him. He would hide them away, lock them in the drawer of his desk. I didn't press him for answers. He was a different person in those last few weeks. I thought perhaps it was just the stress of the work at the church. The bells, you know. But now, I fear it was something more." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Mrs. Wren, I need you to tell me more. What did Thomas say about the bells? About the society that seemed to be connected to them?" Margaret's eyes widened at the mention of the society, and for a moment, Holmes saw something flicker behind her eyes. Fear, perhaps, or recognition. She quickly composed herself, but the brief pause was enough to confirm his suspicions. There was more to her story than she was letting on. I don't know, Mr. Holmes," Margaret stammered, her voice faltering. "He never spoke directly about it. But there were times when I heard him whispering to himself at night. He would talk about a group, someone from the church, someone who wanted him to keep quiet. He said he was afraid that something terrible was going to happen if he didn't obey. He said the bells were the key, that they could change everything." Holmes's mind was racing now, piecing together the fragmented information that had been revealed to him. The bells, the secret society, the fear that had driven Thomas to his death, all of it pointed to something far darker than a simple conspiracy. And Margaret was caught in the middle of it, her fear and confusion clouding the truth. "Why did he never come to you for help, Mrs. Wren?" Watson asked, his voice gentle but pressing. "Why did he keep this fear from you?" Margaret's face softened for a moment, and her gaze dropped to the floor. "Because he didn't want me to know," she whispered, the words barely audible. "He didn't want me to be dragged into it. I thought it was just his imagination. I never believed him. I never thought it could be real." Holmes observed her in silence, his eyes narrowing as he considered her words. There was a flicker of guilt in her expression, a sense of regret that seemed to haunt her. But there was also something else, a shadow of something more. Holmes stood slowly, his mind turning over the puzzle in front of him. "Mrs. Wren, I believe you are telling us the truth, but I also believe you know more than you're saying. These letters, where are they? What happened to them?" Margaret bit her lip, her eyes darting to the small desk in the corner of the room. It was clear she was debating whether or not to reveal more. After a long moment, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're gone," she said. "When Thomas died, I destroyed them. I couldn't keep them. I couldn't bear to look at them anymore." Holmes's expression softened ever so slightly, though his mind was already moving forward. This was a key moment, but it wasn't enough. There were still too many gaps in the story. Margaret Wren had just revealed her own internal struggle, but the truth was still out of reach. "Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Wren," Holmes said, his voice calm and measured. "But I fear we are only just beginning to uncover the full extent of what Thomas was involved in. And I will need your help if we are to understand the mystery of his death." The afternoon shadows stretched long across the streets as Holmes and Watson made their way through the town, the chill in the air biting at their skin. The streets were quieter now, the usual bustle of London dampened by the mystery that hung over them. Holmes's mind, however, was far from quiet. It was racing, piecing together the fragmented clues that had accumulated in the past few days. They arrived at their rented quarters, a modest room near the edge of town. Holmes wasted no time in setting down his hat and coat, turning to face Watson with an intensity that seemed to pulse in the room. The two men had been through many cases together, but this one had begun to gnaw at Holmes in a way he could not easily ignore. Watson took his seat by the small fireplace, the crackling fire offering a welcome warmth against the cold outside. Holmes paced before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind already formulating the theory that had been taking shape throughout the day. "Watson," Holmes began, his voice low and steady, "we are facing something far more insidious than a mere murder. The death of Thomas Wren is only a single piece in a much larger puzzle. The secret society, the bells, the cryptic letters, it all points to something buried deep within this town, but it is not just about Thomas's death. No, Watson, it's about what Thomas knew and what he was willing to die for." Watson leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You've been saying that from the beginning, Holmes. But what is it about these bells that makes them so important? Why would someone go to such lengths to silence Thomas Wren?" Holmes stopped pacing, his sharp gaze landing on Watson as though the answer had been clear all along. "The bells, Watson, are not merely a symbol. They are the key. A key that unlocks something far older, far darker than anything we've yet uncovered. This secret society, which seems to have been operating under the guise of the church, has a vested interest in the bells. Not just because of their sound, but because of their connection to an ancient ritual." Watson looked at Holmes, his confusion evident. "A ritual?" Holmes nodded, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table as he continued. "Yes, a ritual that, from what I can deduce, has been going on for generations. Thomas was likely not the first bell ringer to become entangled in this, There are hints in the letters Margaret spoke of that suggest this is a long-standing tradition, one that centres around the church bells. I believe the bells themselves are not just instruments of sound, Watson, but of power. They are meant to signal something. Signal what? Watson asked, leaning forward, his eyes wide with the intrigue that was always stirred by Holmes's words. Holmes's eyes darkened, and he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Power, Watson. A power that the society wishes to control. And Thomas, with his knowledge, was at the centre of it. His death was not random. He was killed because he learned something that the society could not afford for him to know. The bells were meant to be the final part of a ritual that would grant those who control them unimaginable power. Watson's eyes widened in realization. So the silence of the bells, their stopping, is a signal in itself. It was meant to cover up the society's actions. Holmes nodded sharply, his mind already leaping ahead to the next part of the puzzle. Exactly. The bells were stopped deliberately, not as a symbol of grief, but as a cover. And I believe they are now being used to manipulate those who don't understand their true significance. Margaret Wren's testimony, though incomplete, shows us that Thomas knew more than he should have. He tried to fight against it, but ultimately, he was silenced. Watson sat back, processing the weight of Holmes's theory. So, who within the church could be behind this? Could Father Edward be involved? Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing as he thought back to the conversations he had had with the priest. I suspect Father Edward, yes. But I do not think he is the mastermind. He is too conflicted, too weak to be the one pulling the strings. He knows more than he has said, but I believe his role is that of an unwilling participant. There is someone else, someone much more powerful within the town, someone who has been orchestrating this scheme from the shadows. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still something elusive about it all. Holmes could feel it, the presence of someone hidden just out of view, someone who had been orchestrating every move, every deception. Watson leaned forward, his tone pressing. Who could it be, then? Who would have the power to control the bells and keep a secret society going for so long? Holmes turned to face him fully now, his eyes glittering with the sharpness of a man who could almost see the final pieces of the puzzle. That, Watson, is what we must uncover next. But there is one more thing. Holmes's voice grew softer, almost contemplative. I believe the final clue lies within the church itself. There is something hidden within the bell tower, something that will explain the society's involvement and the role of the bells in their rituals. We need to return to the church. Watson nodded, his expression set with the determination that had accompanied him on every investigation. Let's go then. We've come too far to turn back now. As they prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He turned back to Watson, his expression thoughtful. The society is not simply trying to protect its secrets. They are trying to control the future, and I will not allow them to succeed. The night had fallen, cloaking London in a shroud of mist. Holmes and Watson stood before St. Dunstan's once more, the dim light of the lantern casting long, wavering shadows on the damp stone steps. The church seemed even more ominous in the darkness, its towering spires cutting into the night sky like the fingers of some ancient, silent giant. The bells, silent as they had been for days, hung overhead like a forgotten promise. Holmes felt the weight of the night press against him, but it did not deter him. He had come too far, uncovered too many secrets, to let it end without the truth being revealed. The air smelled of damp stone and the cold earth beneath their feet. The wind carried with it a faint scent of old incense, which seemed to cling to the very walls of the church. As the fog rolled in, swallowing the landscape beyond the churchyard, Holmes could almost feel the pulse of something ancient stirring in the shadows. "Do you feel it, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would disturb the very air around them. Watson, standing beside him, glanced at the detective with a look of quiet understanding. The weight of it all? Yes. There's something wrong here, Holmes. Something we can't see yet. Holmes nodded, his gaze focused on the church's darkened bell tower. Exactly. But we will see it tonight, Watson. Everything we have learned, all the pieces we have gathered, will lead us to the truth. There is one final question we need to answer. Who is truly behind this conspiracy? They entered the church, the heavy doors creaking as they pushed them open. The silence inside was deafening, thick and unnerving. The faint glow of their lantern flickered in the vast, empty space, casting strange shadows on the stone floor. Holmes's mind was already at work, piecing together the final movements of the puzzle. They made their way up the narrow staircase that led to the bell tower, their footsteps echoing eerily in the quiet, as though the church itself was listening to their approach. The narrow walls felt oppressive, the air growing colder with each step they took. It was as though they were descending into the very bowels of the church, moving ever closer to the heart of the mystery. When they reached the bell chamber, Holmes paused before pushing open the door. The room was bathed in the faint glow of their lantern. The bells, massive and silent, loomed above them, casting long shadows. Holmes's gaze flickered over the room, the intricate mechanisms of the bells visible in the dim light. He studied the room for a long moment, noting the subtle details that had eluded him in their previous visits. "Look at this," Holmes murmured, pointing to the corner of the room. There, hidden in the shadow of one of the bells, was a wooden chest. It looked old, its surface worn with age and neglect. "This is it, Watson. The final piece of the puzzle." Watson stepped forward, his hand brushing against the chest, which felt cold and solid beneath his fingertips. Holmes had already begun to open it, his movements swift and sure. The chest creaked as it opened, revealing a collection of papers, letters, documents, and strange symbols scrawled across aged parchment. As Holmes sifted through them, his eyes lit with recognition. "This," Holmes said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a sense of deep satisfaction, "is what we've been looking for. These papers belong to the secret society. They detail the rituals, the ceremonies, the very purpose of the bells. And here," he said, pulling out a particularly worn document, "here is the final instruction. The bells were never meant to be silent, Watson. They were the key to awakening something that could grant control over the town, perhaps even the power to manipulate events on a larger scale." Holmes stood in silence for a moment, his mind racing with the implications. Thomas Wren was not just a bell ringer. He was a witness to something that would change everything. The society could not afford to let him live. His knowledge had become a threat to their plans. Just as Holmes was about to speak again, there was a sudden movement at the door. It was Father Edward, his face pale, his hands trembling. He stepped into the room, his eyes flicking between the chest and Holmes. "You've found it," the priest said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no surprise in his tone, only resignation. "I knew you would, but you've come too late." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward. "Too late for what, Father? To stop your plans? To stop the society you've been hiding behind the veil of your church?" Father Edward's face darkened, his lips curling into a thin, bitter smile. "You don't understand, Holmes. You never did. This wasn't about power. It was about preservation. The ritual was never about controlling others. It was about protecting us. The bells are the final safeguard. But if they are not rung, if the ritual is not completed, everything will collapse." "Collapse?" Watson repeated, his confusion evident. "What are you talking about?" Father Edward took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he continued. "The society wasn't just a group of men trying to control the church or the town. We were guarding something far more ancient, far more dangerous. The bells, when rung in the proper sequence, would have sealed away a power that could destroy us all. But the power is slipping, and without the bells, it will awaken. I thought we had time to finish the ritual, but now it's too late." Holmes stepped back, his mind racing as the pieces clicked together. So, Thomas's death wasn't just about stopping him from revealing the society's existence. It was about stopping him from completing the ritual. Father Edward nodded, his gaze distant. He was the last one who knew the full sequence. He was too close to understanding it. If he had completed it, the power would have been sealed away for good. But now, without the bells, we are all doomed. The ritual will never be finished, and the power will rise again. Watson took a step forward, his voice sharp. What power? What are you talking about? Father Edward met his gaze, his eyes filled with a deep, haunting fear. The power to control death itself, he whispered. The power to bring back those who have passed. The bells were the only thing keeping it at bay. The silence in the room was deafening. Holmes, his expression unreadable, took a moment to digest the priest's words. The mystery was no longer about murder or conspiracy. It was about something far darker, something that transcended the mortal world. I see now, Holmes said quietly, his eyes focused on the priest. And you, Father, were willing to let this happen, to let this power rise, to unleash it, because you feared its wrath more than anything else. Father Edward looked away, a shudder passing through him. I had no choice, Holmes. I didn't want this. But the bells, the ritual, they were the only thing that kept it locked away. And now, it's too late. The church was silent again. The bell tower, its giant, unmoving bells looming overhead like some forgotten relic of a past age, felt somehow more menacing now, as though the very air had thickened, weighed down by the terrible secret it had been hiding. Holmes stood in the centre of the room, his eyes scanning the shadows, the papers he had uncovered in his hands, his mind still racing over the words of Father Edward. The priest had told them everything, or so it seemed, but there was a strange, lingering sense of finality that came with those words. The power had not yet risen, but Holmes knew they were running out of time. Watson stood nearby, his face troubled, his hands gripping the edges of his coat as if trying to steady himself against the storm of revelations. He had witnessed many dark truths with Holmes over the years, but this was something far beyond the usual scope of their cases. They were no longer simply facing a murder or a conspiracy. They were facing something far more primal, something that could alter the very course of life and death. You understand now, Watson, Holmes said, his voice quiet but steady, why the bells must ring. It is not merely a matter of ritual or of some obscure ancient secret. It is a matter of balance. The society believed that by ringing the bells, they would prevent this power from ever being awakened. Thomas knew that, and it's why he became a target. Watson swallowed hard, his throat dry, his eyes fixed on the darkened corners of the church, as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows. But it didn't happen, Holmes. Father Edward, the society, they were too late. We found the bell tower and the ritual too late to stop it, didn't we? Holmes did not answer immediately. He folded the papers carefully, his mind turning over the implications of their findings. He looked at Watson, his expression unreadable, his brow furrowed in thought. It is not over yet, Watson. Not completely. The priest stood against the far wall, his posture slumped, his face gaunt with fear and regret. He had confessed everything, his own fear of the power he had tried to control, his guilt over Thomas's death, and his realization that without the bells, there was nothing to stop the forces they had been guarding against. I thought I could keep it at bay, Father Edward said, his voice hoarse with the weight of his confession. I didn't want to believe it. But now I see that we were all fools. Holmes's gaze never left the priest. You were not the only one, Father. It's easy to believe that we can control the things we cannot see, things we do not understand. But in the end, the truth is undeniable. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until Holmes finally stepped forward, his expression unwavering. Father Edward, you must be held accountable for your actions. Your involvement in the society and the death of Thomas Wren cannot be overlooked. But there is still a chance, one last chance, to prevent this power from being unleashed. Father Edward's eyes lifted, fear and desperation flooding his features. What do you mean? It's too late, Holmes. The bells, they cannot be rung. The ritual is broken, and without the bells, we cannot stop what is coming. We were foolish to think we could. Holmes turned to Watson, his mind whirring with final thoughts, final decisions. Perhaps it is not too late, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The bells may be silent, but they do not hold all the answers. We can still fight this, Watson. We have the knowledge now, the knowledge of the ritual, the knowledge of the society, and we can use it. Watson looked at Holmes, still processing the enormity of what was unfolding. But how? The bells are the key, Holmes. The power is already stirring. The society believed in the ritual to control it. How can we stop it without it? Holmes's eyes narrowed, his voice low with resolve. We stop it not by trying to control it, Watson, but by taking away its ability to thrive. This ritual, the power it centers on, it requires belief. It thrives on fear, on control. What we need now is to dismantle that fear. We must expose the society's secrets to the light. Let everyone know what they were hiding. Father Edward trembled as he listened, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. You think the people of this town will stand against it? They have been so blind to it all. They won't believe me. They'll think I'm mad. Holmes's voice softened, but there was no doubt in his tone. It does not matter what they believe, Father. It matters what they know. Once the truth is laid bare, they will no longer be able to hide in the shadows of ignorance. The society's grip on this town will loosen, and the power that they sought to control will fade with the light of truth. Watson stood, his gaze steady now, his hand resting on his friend's shoulder. And we'll make sure of it, won't we, Holmes? We'll expose it all. Holmes nodded, his gaze lifting to the towering bells above them. Yes, Watson, we will expose it all, and we'll make sure that the silence of these bells remains broken, for good. The church felt different now, emptier, yet somehow more alive, as though the very air had shifted. Holmes, Watson, and Father Edward stood together, a strange sense of finality settling over them, even as the weight of the truth still pressed upon their shoulders. The power that had once been hidden behind the bells, behind the rituals, behind the lies, would no longer have the hold it had once enjoyed. Outside, the fog began to lift, and the faintest glimmer of dawn broke through the sky, signalling the end of the darkness. But it was only the beginning of a new chapter. The bells had been silenced, but now their sound would ring out once more, carrying with it the truth that had long been buried. As Holmes turned to leave the church, he couldn't help but feel the faint stirrings of something in the air, a feeling that perhaps this case was not as complete as it seemed. But that was for another time. For now, the bell tower stood still, its mystery unravelled, its power stripped away. And that, for Holmes, was enough, for now.